my older view that the Bible is the inspired Word of God with no errors in it came under fire for just this reason. We don't have the originals of any of the copies of the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible either. What we have are copies that were made centuries later in most cases by scribes, some of whom weren't very good, and these copies that we have all have changes in them. This is what my earlier book on misquoting Jesus was about, is that we have thousands of copies, and these thousands of copies have hundreds of thousands of differences in them. And I got to a point where it no longer made sense for me to say that God had inspired the words of this text, because we don't have the words of this text. And so what would be the point of even saying God had inspired them? We don't have them. And so this was another sort of moment for me when I realized that, in fact, this older belief of mine simply wasn't credible. And I started realizing that, in fact, there are a lot of mistakes in the Bible. Contradictions, discrepancies, different points of view. Different authors have different things that they have to say about fundamental issues, about who Jesus is, who God is, what salvation is. And so that the Bible is not a unified monolith. In fact, it's a book that has lots of different points of view represented in it. Let me talk about the surviving copies that we do have. First, give you a sense of the numbers of books that we're talking about. New Testament was originally written in Greek, and at last count we had over 5,700 copies of the New Testament in the Greek language in which it was originally written. These copies can be compared with one another, and when you compare these copies with one another, there are lots of mistakes in them, because no two of these copies are exactly alike in their wording. Many of these differences in the manuscripts are so unimportant that you can't replicate them in translation. Okay? In other words, like they changed the word order in Greek, where you would have to translate the same way no matter what the Greek word order is. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter very much. By far, the vast majority of these hundreds of thousands of differences are significant for nothing more than showing that scribes in antiquity could spell no better than my students can today. And scribes, of course, didn't have spell check. Scribes, in fact, didn't even have dictionaries. And many scribes didn't care how they spelled anything. Sometimes you'll be reading a manuscript and there'll be the same word that occurs, say, 3 times within a couple of lines, and the scribe will spell the same word 3 different ways. He just doesn't care how the word is spelled. Well, so, you know, you've got lots and lots of those kinds of changes, and what do they matter for? They don't matter at all. So, having said there are all these hundreds of thousands of differences, I want to stress that most of them don't matter for very much. Some of these changes, the ones that don't matter, basically, are accidental mistakes. Scribes were sometimes tired or sleepy, sometimes they were distracted, sometimes they were inept or unqualified, and they made mistakes. They would leave out a word, they'd leave out a verse, sometimes they'd leave out a page. They just made mistakes sometimes. Mistakes where scribes just slip up, and intentional mistakes where it looks like scribes are actually trying to change the text. Now, I don't know for sure that scribes are trying to change the text. I don't have any scribes around to interrogate about the matter, but there are some changes that don't look like they could possibly simply be a slip of the pen. And there are others that are debatable, whether they were a slip of the pen or not. But let me give you a couple of examples, and you'll see that some of these look like scribes maybe wanted to change the text. I'll give you a couple for instances. In Mark chapter 1, the Gospel of Mark, we read at the very beginning that as was written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face to prepare your way for you. Okay? This is in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before you. This is a very interesting passage because the passage that's quoted is not Isaiah. It says in Isaiah the prophet and then gives the quotation. The passage quoted is actually Exodus. So it's interesting that in the later manuscripts of Mark's Gospel, the text is changed. So that it no longer says in Isaiah, as is written in Isaiah the prophet. Now it says, as is written in the prophet.